Welcome back to Made for More. I am your host, Holly J. Moore. I am a divorce lawyer who is passionate about helping all of us to use the difficult things in our life to grow and show up as a better version of ourselves tomorrow than we are today. I am joined today and thankfully every day by, one of the men in my life, Aaron Bender.
I was going to say, not a man.
I was almost going to say like one of the manliest men I know. And I was like, no, the shoe does not fit.
No, that dude's at home.
That's true.
That dude's at home. Abby actually teases when I don't get projects done around the house. She's like, I think I'll call my boyfriend. I'm like, your boyfriend? What are you talking about? The guy you were before we got married. But I do a lot of projects around the house.
Yeah,
yes,
you do.
I am a manly man.
Yes, you are.
Sometimes,
Yes.
sometimes. But we get to dive in today with one of your favorite topics with Dan Griffin talking all about masculinity in today's day and age.
Yeah. What else is there to say? Yeah.
We could just go the ASMR route. We were practicing that. We're talking about men in 2025.
We are joined today by Dan Griffin, author, thought leader, and expert on men's relationships and masculinity. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So my husband is feeling all sorts of relief right now because I'm always like, well, I want you to come on my podcast. And he's like, well, what do you even talk about? And I'm like, I don't know. He doesn't have any particular expertise, except I'm like, you're really good at being a man. But we don't need him anymore because we have you. So, and you actually sound like you have some formal expertise on masculinity. So I'm excited to talk to you about that.
I'm looking forward to the conversation, and we'll see what your husband thinks after the show.
Oh, yes. Okay, that'll be fun. Okay, so let's start off with, you have this sort of concept, theory that you call the man rules. What are the man rules?
Well, it's on coffee mugs all over the country.
Yes.
And you can get them at any CVS or 7-Eleven.
Yes.
That's a first for me, so I love that. Thank you for
good.
that. That's a nice touch. Some people call it the man box. Some people call it the code of masculinity. I call it the man rules, but it's very intentionally, right? But the man rules are the ideas that we learn as boys and even girls, right? It's in this collective gender conditioning, but of what it means to be a real man. And when I work with audiences, I will often have them name the man rules. And it could be a 16-year-olds, like high school students, and it could be like people from anywhere 30 to 60 years old. I am going to get the same rules every time.
Oh.
And so the man rules are really these ideas that we internalize, but that are not always explicitly stated. And it's almost like when I'm working with men in particular, and I have them articulate these, for some of them, it's like the first time when we put them all down on paper where they like see them and they're like, oh yeah, that's kind of how I've been living my life without a lot of choice. That's why I call them the man rules, right? Because you usually don't have a lot of choice in making rules.
Right.
You usually, there's consequences if you don't follow the rules. And there's an implication of right and wrong, good or bad. And that's how the man rules are. So, we could go into more depth about like what they are, but I'll just say, like, I'll ask you, pretend like you're in my audience, right?
Okay. Yeah. I was so scared you were going to ask me this. I was like, is he going to ask me what the man rules are?
So think about, like, as little boys, little girls, what are some of the rules that we learn? What are the ideas we learn about what it means to be a real man? Like, just if they had little rules, what would they be?
Don't cry.
Bam! Right?
Yeah.
I could stop right there. I've been doing this for years, right? Don't cry is the number one rule, always. And what does that say? Because I don't know. There's a very interesting conversation of masculinity that's happening in our country right now. It's kind of happening. It's also just kind of unfolding, not really thoughtfully or really consciously.
Okay.
And there's this reactive force or population of people that are like, they're threatened by what's changing. and they want to go back to traditional masculinity as they see it, and they think that's what's good and right.
Okay.
And then there's another group that says, that doesn't work for me. I want something different.
Oh.
And it's not super well defined, but it's defined in contrast to traditional masculinity. But these rules, we live with them, and they kind of rule us a lot of the time, and we don't even realize it. And so, like, we literally could spend the rest of this podcast just talking about the don't cry rule and its effect on men and our relationships and even our lives, in the sense of like how long we live.
A prenuptial agreement, or sometimes called a premarital agreement, is an agreement that two parties enter into before they get married that basically chooses to deviate from state law. It assigns rights and responsibilities regarding assets and debts that are acquired during the marriage. Some common misconceptions about prenups are, one, that they basically doom the marriage to failure, or that it's really planning to divorce, and neither of those things are true. But the real value of a prenup is talking about and creating rules around how the things that you acquire during the marriage are going to be characterized. A prenup can protect things like art collections, real estate portfolios, businesses, all those types of assets. The ideal timeline to get a prenup is not 2 weeks before the wedding. The final version of a prenup has to be presented to the parties 7 days before they actually sign it. So there's like a 7-day waiting period. As soon as you get engaged, you should seek a lawyer's advice and counsel on a prenup and start the process then, because the closer the prenup is signed to the wedding, the more likely that the court is going to think there was some sort of duress involved in that person signing it, and they have to prove that the prenup was signed voluntarily in order for them to be enforced. At More Family Law Group, we represent a lot of high-profile people, celebrities, professional athletes, business tycoons. If you already have a lot of assets, or you think you're going to be acquiring a lot of assets during your marriage, we are the best ones to protect that for you and help you make your marriage stronger. Call More Family Law Group today. Okay, so do you think the don't cry rule is good or bad? Or it's probably not that easy.
You got it. I don't really get into like good or bad for most of them. There's some of the rules, right, that are like, they're so strong and they're so almost either violent or negative that it's kind of hard not to say, like, I'm pretty sure like that's not good, right? Like,
right.
One of the man rules is don't be a girl.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, for a lot of guys, they're like, yeah, of course I'm not going to be a girl. I'm going to be a guy. But it's the value judgment you place on that. What do we say to little boys who are not acting very manly or acting, very tough? We call them what?
Girls.
What else do we call them?
Well, little sissies.
Sissies. And then if you want to get even uglier, right?
Yeah.
How are we with language on this?
I'm not going to say it. You say it.
Okay. Right? But think about it, right?
I called myself one earlier, actually.
So,
because I cried, actually, ironically.
Right?
I was like, I'm turning into a...
There you go.
So...
there you go, right?
Yeah.
So like even that kind of language it's embedded in how we think about masculinity and femininity and toughness and all of that. And then, you just gave a great example. And then there's all the messages we send to ourselves that by the time we're adults, nobody needs to be monitoring us anymore. We're the ones who are saying, stop crying like a little bitch.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Man up, whatever the hell that means.
Right. Yeah.
And so because my focus is on mental health, because it's on trauma, because it's on recovery, it's like, where's the compassion? Where's the sense of like, I mean, you can live, I've done it. I'm 52. You can live a life of self-abuse, but it's never going to make you happy.
Right.
So if we don't learn how to, and how we talk to ourselves, I really believe is coded in the gender conditioning. I mean,
Right.
Brene Brown literally says the things that bring us to our knees are so often driven by gender.
Ooh, that's profound. So, what do you think the state of masculinity is currently? I mean, that's not a loaded question
there
or
is no
anything.
state of masculinity. I think that's one of the challenges, right? So I talk
Okay.
about this concept called conscious masculinity because, like, just when you asked, what do you think of this rule? Is it good or bad? I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But what I talk about is conscious masculinity in the sense of when you're a man living by the man rules, you're probably not that conscious
Right.
because you just have these dictates telling you who you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to live. But I'll tell guys, like, another rule is don't be emotional, right?
Yeah.
Just don't be emotional. And then the truth is, the real rule is don't be emotional other than anger, right? Emotions are
Oh,
not
right.
okay except for
Yeah.
anger.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother thing you could unpack, around that.
Yeah.
But, I often, will tell guys, like, hey, there's nothing wrong with not being emotional, right? But if you're in a relationship and your partner is begging you to open up, begging you to share something other than your work day or, just your complaints,
Yeah.
and you can't do it, and then that leads to the end of your relationship, that's probably not the only thing that's going to lead to it, but it'll probably contribute.
Yeah. Well, I'm a divorce lawyer, and I would say like emotional unavailability of men is a huge factor in divorce.
Absolutely.
I mean, not necessarily of men, but emotional unavailability of people
Period.
in a relationship.
Period. But
Yes.
more commonly men, right? So
Yes.
women, like, if we did a gendered kind of analysis of divorce, which I'm sure has been done, but if you did a gendered analysis and, like, kind of what's the most common thing for men, it's probably too much time on work, emotional unavailability, and cheating, like infidelity. And is that accurate?
I mean, I would say those are the problems that people talk about. I have a whole other theory that it's like those are symptoms of underlying things.
100%.
Yes.
100%. In fact, I've noticed how, like, you seem to talk about trauma a fair amount.
Yes.
Trauma,
Trauma.
right?
Yes.
Save the trauma for your mama. But no, I'm a big believer in trauma too. And it's transformed my life, understanding trauma. And
Yeah.
and I agree. It's the surface things. Even emotional unavailability, as men, we come by that very honestly. Because it's all we've been taught since we were little kids.
Yeah.
And thinking that sex is going to be the solution for a lack of intimacy, it's what we've been taught.
Right.
Now, some people are going to hear that and they're going to be like, oh, he's just saying men are victims and they don't have to take responsibility. No, it's an explanation, not an excuse.
Right. Yeah.
Right? But you can't solve the problem if you can't understand it.
True.
And the solution for men being able to stay in relationships, or the solution for men being able to have some sense of, like, true happiness, comes in being able to deconstruct the way they have lived by the man rules a lot of the time, Holly, because it's what keeps them safe.
Yeah.
And they don't even know that. It's just, it's what they've come to realize. It protects them. It protects us. It keeps us safe, and it becomes a default, almost like a trauma response.
Right.
How kind of quickly we can fall into it. And so when you ask, like, what's the current state of masculinity, I think, well, what I often say internally for a lot of men, it's confusion.
Yeah.
Because they don't know what kind of man they're supposed to be.
Right.
And women, frankly, aren't often that helpful.
Right.
Because sometimes women send really mixed messages. Oh, I want a traditional guy. I want you to be sensitive. I want you to be emotional. And then the guy shows up that way, and their own kind of internalized man rules can pop up.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, that's too much.
Yeah, I don't want that.
I don't want that.
I don't know what that is, but I know I don't want it.
Yeah, exactly. I wasn't, that wasn't part of the part of the deal. That wasn't part of the deal. I had a good friend. If you saw him, right, he's a guy in recovery, so he's kind of predisposed toward doing some of this work. Covered in tattoos, tough. He's pretty tough guy. Falls in love with this woman, follows her to Canada. And they get there, and he continues going to therapy, and he continues trying to connect with her emotionally, ironically, and going to his recovery meetings. And at a certain point, she's like, "Oh, you're gonna keep doing that?" Like, I thought you needed that while you were in Minnesota, but now you're with me.
Yeah.
Like, why are you still doing that? They were engaged, and they literally ended the relationship. And I'm really proud of him for choosing himself, frankly, over that level of, to me, I want to call it ignorance, because it's so it's there's such a lack of empathy and such a lack of like real genuine partnership in somebody who takes that approach. But really, it's just what she was from and what she knew, you know, and so women can do it, men can do it. We're all in the water, is what I talk about, right? Yeah. We're all in the water together, trying to make our best way.
Trying to not drown.
trying to not drown. And the other thing I like to say all the time, because I use the water in a lot of the work that I do, there's a lot of toxins in the water. It's not like crystalline blue water. It's like, you know, there's the toxins are addiction and trauma and mental health and stigma and all bias and judgment and ignorance and all of that sort of stuff. And then it really gets in the way of us being able to see each other clearly, you know?
Right. So you said that if you had to sort of put a label on masculinity today, it could possibly be confusion. Do you think part of the reason for that is because women, so how I see it, and I'm not an expert in the field, I just know from sort of my professional life as a divorce lawyer, I see a lot of relationships come and go. and it's fascinating to observe them and how that all goes. And one of the things that I've observed is, and also just like being part of society, is women have gotten more masculine, you know, with the rise in maybe education and financial resources and things like that. But I think also emotionally as well, they've gotten more masculine. And so like I believe there has to be the polarity there, right? So if somebody's the masculine and it happens to be the woman, where does that leave the man? Do you think that's part of the confusion?
It's part of it. I don't, you know, are women, so this is like a whole nother philosophical thing, but, you know, like I do actually believe in like the kind of that yin yang thing that you're talking about, the polarities of the balancing and that sort of thing. But I also kind of see it a little bit differently. I mean, I joke sometimes that my wife is the man in our relationship.
Okay.
But I'm also a pretty like manly dude, but I'm also like very in touch with my feelings.
Yeah.
Sometimes maybe a little too much.
Okay.
And so I think we're out of balance. Okay. We're out of balance, but I don't think where we're out of balance means like, for instance, there's some people, and I can't remember her name. There's this one talk show person, young woman, and she's like, men talking about their feelings, that's stupid. They just need to make the money, keep us happy, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, so I get where you're coming from, because that used to be the reality. That was 1950s. And that was reality. I mean, like that was her grandparents, but she wants that back, right? Okay. So that's one group of people. They want that back. They want like that really clear division of like, when men were men and women were women.
Mm-hmm.
They want it back. It's never coming back.
Right.
It's never coming back. The as we say.
Well, hopefully we've grown. And
to me, that's what it is. It's evolution, right? We're evolving. Right. And so, like, think about it, what you're saying. Like, women are making more money than ever before. They have better jobs than ever before. They're better educated than ever before. They they're a much larger percentage of students in college and universities than young men. And so it's like, as people, other podcasters and experts have said, it's like women, they've got momentum.
Yeah.
Like y'all are doing well.
Yeah.
When you look at the look at you. You got your own mountain behind you.
That's right, I do. No man has that.
Yeah, exactly. Not especially no white men. Right. And so it's kind of like this conversation of like, all right, so what is balance? And so there's individual balance, and then there's like this collective balance. Collectively, we're still out of balance, but it's interesting kind of how it's shifting. Individually, that's where I think people are really out of balance, because it's like they don't. I mean, my bias in this conversation is that people aren't paying attention to this. They're not really. That's why I call it conscious masculinity. Right. Like, who do I want to consciously be? Not who did my dad say I had to be, or who was my dad and how was he, or what do I think, is the cool thing to be right now, or whatever. But like, in my heart of hearts, what kind of man do I want to be?
Yeah.
And can I give myself permission to be that man? So, and then where this speaks to your comment, I think. And then where's my energy leading me?
Right.
Right? So it's like, I used to, when I first got into recovery, I used to think that I was a much more kind of, for lack of a better term, it's not a good term, but softer male. I thought I was like, because I knew I was emotional and sensitive and all that stuff. And so I thought that meant like I was kind of more of a B, like a beta guy.
Okay.
Yeah, But my energy is not that. My energy is assertiveness. My energy is confidence. My energy is leadership and that kind of stuff, and humor and whatever. Okay. I'm pretty clear on that.
Yeah.
It doesn't change the fact that internally there's still a bunch of insecurity, anxiety, self-doubt. It's just not nearly as strong as it used to be. The problem with a lot of men today is that they still don't have permission to be honest about what's happening within them internally. Because it's kind of like Fight Club, right? The number one rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. The number one rule of the man rules is you don't talk about the man rules.
Right.
You can't be vulnerable. You can't say, and that's what I love about being in recovery and in the 12-step community, because it's guys all the time saying like, oh my God, I finally feel like I spent so much time trying to prove myself in the corporate world or in acting or in this or in that. And now I can finally be like, oh, like it was so hard pretending that it wasn't hard.
Right. Oh, that's a good one. That's a writer downer. So hard pretending that it wasn't hard. What you've mentioned being in recovery a couple times in the 12-step program. Is that what led you to start doing this work, or how did you come upon wanting to starting this
So
work?
It was really interesting, right? So it was just like this convergence of things happening. So first off, I'm now, anyways, I'm 6 feet tall, and I'm, pretty good looking guy.
Have you not always been 6 feet in your adult life?
Well, no, that's the point, right? So I'm 6 feet tall, pretty good looking guy. But when I was in high school, I was 5 feet tall.
Oh, okay.
And I actually
Nothing wrong with being 5 feet tall, by the way.
Nothing wrong with being 5 feet tall. But when you're a guy, and not only 5 feet tall, but haven't hit puberty.
Yeah.
It's rough in high school, right? And so part of it was I ended up getting growth hormone shots to grow,
really?
to kind of instigate growth, which was a humiliating experience. And it's definitely one of the kind of experiences of trauma that I had growing up, especially, in the context of living in a violent alcoholic home.
Oh.
And so the reason I share this is because when that happened and I wasn't growing and I watched all these young guys growing, I started to deconstruct masculinity in my own way.
Wow.
Because I had to somehow feel good about myself by seeing what either was wrong with them or what I didn't want or something, right?
Yeah.
So just intellectually, I started doing that. Then I got into college, and right around the same time that I got sober, I got into sociology and I got into gender studies. And it was kind of happenstance. One of the women that I knew asked me if I wanted to take the sociology of women class. And I was like, why? Why would I ever do that? Yeah. And then she looked at me and she said, because it's going to be all women.
I was like, actually, for a young man, it's probably kind
right?
of a brilliant thing to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
It wasn't my idea, but it was hers. And I went, and it changed my life, right?
Wow.
It changed my life from the perspective of that I heard women's experience in a way that I had never heard it in my first 20 years of life.
Yeah.
But we started talking about gender, and then I talked to the professor, and I was like, is anybody thinking about this for men? And she's like, I don't know. Why don't you look? And so I did. And it became my senior thesis, looking at masculinity. And then I got into recovery. And I know this is a little longer story, but I think it's really, for me, it's been very powerful. So I got the seed planted of gender. Yeah. Then I got into recovery. And then I started going to meetings. And in my first meetings, like a guy came up to me, he tried to hug me. This is 30 years ago.
Yeah.
The guy tried to hug me. Guys were talking about feelings. And I'm guessing you'll appreciate this. I got sober in Virginia, small town Virginia.
Okay.
And there was this guy, Bud, right? You could probably imagine Bud already.
Yeah.
And he walks into the meeting and people are like, hey, Bud. And I look at him and I'm like, what am I doing here? These losers, right? Because Bud, he epitomized what I thought, 12-step was. Anyways, halfway through that meeting, Bud, of course, because God's got a great sense of humor, speaks up and starts sharing. Oh. And he's like, emotional, he's vulnerable, he's scared about losing his marriage again, he's struggling in his sobriety, and I'm like, what is happening here? Nobody, because this was Bud walked in, he had a greasy white t-shirt, he had a hat that said honk if you love tits.
Okay.
He had jeans, and I'm like, what has this guy got to teach me or show me or anything? And of course, it blew me away because I was like, who is this guy? He's talking about being afraid and sad and what is happening? Yeah. All of that to say, that kind of really blew me away. And then I started thinking about it in the context of masculinity. And I was like, men in recovery, and then ultimately it got extrapolated, men in treatment, men in personal growth, they express themselves differently than quote unquote traditional masculinity. And they expressed themselves in a way that I had some awareness was true for me because I had some awareness of my internal life and my internal voices. But I had never heard men talking about. I'd never heard men talking like that. And that is what started me kind of on this path of the last 30 years.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay. So I was gripped. I was hanging on every word. I don't have a next question. I don't know. Oh my gosh. Why? I do have another question. Of course I do. You mentioned earlier, you made the comment kind of in passing that someone was in recovery and therefore would be predisposed to do this kind of work. Tell me more about that.
Good catch. So, in my master's research, which I did on the social construction of masculinity in the culture of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? So that was my master's qualitative study.
Okay. That's fascinating.
And in that, I coined a term called, what was it called? Let's see. So there's conscious masculinity, and then there's this other type, and it was, what the hell is it called? I can't think of it, but the idea is that you're just a little bit more flexible in your masculinity. So you have traditional masculinity, which tends to be a bit rigid. This is what a man is. This is how I am, and that's just what it is. And then there was this flexible masculinity. It's not what I called it. I called it something else, but it's the same idea. And in that, it's kind of like guys come into recovery and are immediately told, like, you got to start opening up. You got to start talking to other men. You got to talk about what's going on in your life. You got to learn how to talk about feelings. You got to ask for help. Over and over and over and over again. So you see how, like, all of those are elements of therapeutic intervention or personal growth.
Right.
They're also the opposite of masculinity. Mm-hmm. Which that, to me, that's the crux of so much of the work that I do is that the trajectory for health, personal growth, personal awareness, and recovery are almost the exact opposite, right? Of the man rules and traditional masculinity. But when a guy gets into recovery, he's in a culture. Another researcher said this, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. He said, what is culturally proscribed becomes culturally prescribed.
Okay.
And that's exactly what it is. So men aren't allowed to ask for help, and now here men are supposed to ask for help. Men aren't supposed to talk to other men about anything other than politics or, whatever. And now they get to have a much broader conversation and language. Right. So you have these two things happening. And as a result of that, over and over, men being exposed to that and living in this subculture of the 12-step world, they get predisposed toward things. That's why here's the most interesting phenomenon, and I don't know if you've run into this in your demographic. It's the men that I've known over the years who are the ones trying to get their female partners to go to counseling.
Yes,
to go
I've
to
seen
couples
that a lot.
counseling, to go to therapy, to get help, to try to save the marriage, to communicate, to do all sorts of stuff that traditionally it's the men that we say don't do those things.
Correct. Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I say he was kind of predisposed. By virtue of living in that 12-step culture, he was already kind of living in a world where he was like, oh, it makes sense to ask for help. It makes sense that we're having a hard time in our relationship. Why wouldn't we go to couples counseling? That just makes complete sense.
Yeah. So, what's a man to do? I mean, so men they're raised with these man rules. It's just so indoctrinated into our society that there's no escaping them. I think, in terms of you can probably escape them with some internal work, but like you live by them before you get to the point of doing the work, perhaps. So we have that. We have sort of the masculine and feminine dynamics of, men are supposed to be the protector, the provider, the whatever the third P is. I can't remember. But now we're sort of realizing that perhaps men suppressing their emotions for their entire life maybe isn't the best thing. And perhaps men being unwilling to ask for help isn't the best thing. So, what's a man to do?
Well, I think it starts with a little humility. I think it starts with a man being willing to ask the question honestly, is who I am and how I live really reflective of the man I truly want to be? And the challenge, Holly, I would say is no man or woman, frankly,
Yeah.
is able to ask that question by themselves. So I mean, by myself, I have too many blinders. I'm going to come up with conclusions about me and my character and who I am and the way I'm living that, are going to be close, possibly, but not the same as if I were to sit down with somebody else who really knew me and give me really honest and open feedback. But it also has to be somebody who has the ability themselves, to tell the truth. And frankly, one of the hallmarks of a lot of marriages and relationships is we stop telling the truth to each other.
Yeah.
And ourselves. We convince ourselves that we're happier in our marriages than we are. We convince ourselves that we're not as I don't want to say it's not necessarily about a lack of happiness as much as of like truly paying attention in our marriages in all the different areas and being willing to talk about them. I literally was just talking to a guy before here, and he's having some really tough times talking about sex with his partner.
Okay.
And it's like sex and finances, romance and finance. Those tend to be the big ones.
Yeah.
But it's like we're either growing together or we're growing apart. I'm sure you've heard that. And the way we grow together is by telling the truth to ourselves and to each other. But it's also what we were talking about is I said it's also about knowing when to tell the truth to your close confidants.
Right.
And then live with what you need to live with in order to be a partner and in order to realize that marriage is never about always getting your way or having it look the way you want it to look.
Wow. Yes, I agree. That is so true. And probably so much harder to do than to say and to, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's human nature. Like this isn't a judgment about anybody.
Right.
But when you say, what's a guy to do? Just pause, man. Just pause and ask yourself. Literally what I said. And if you need help, then look in specific areas. How am I doing in relationships?
Yeah.
Ask about specific relationships. And if you even have the courage, talk to those relationships. Right. I mean, I wrote a book called A Man's Way Through Relationships. And at the end of every chapter, there's like assignments. Because I know like so many of us, we learn by actually doing this stuff. And it was often like, have a conversation with your partner about this. Have a conversation with your best friend about this. Have a conversation. Have a conversation. Have a conversation.
Yeah.
We live and change and transform in conversation.
Yeah. The very thing that I think a lot of men are not necessarily inclined to do.
Not inclined, maybe not taught.
Right.
And even more than not taught. Like, all right, so here's another fascinating kind of dichotomy that I discovered. So I talked about like the dichotomy of the man rules and recovery or therapy. And then when I was working on the relationships book, I was interviewing men. And interestingly, the reason I wrote the relationships book is because when I interviewed the men for my first book, A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, all the guys talked about was relationships.
Oh, how fascinating.
Right?
That's
Which is what guys are not
interesting.
supposed to focus on or care about or any of that stuff. And
Oh,
that's all they talked about.
That's all that is very interesting.
Right. And then another little story, even about my book, it took 4 publishers to even get my second book published. And I had like, even, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I mean, several publishers told me men are not going to buy a book about relationships. And I'm like, well, there's one way to guarantee they're not going to buy a book about relationships.
That's to not publish it.
To not publish it. Yeah. Now, here's another thing though. I've learned a lot over these years, and it's about knowing your audience. I wrote a book and it's called A Man's Way Through Relationships, Learning to Love and Be Loved. Now, is that the title for my audience? Probably not. At the heart of it, when men are really open and honest, like that is the right title, but that's not the title that's going to,
right.
They've got too much in them that's going to be like, react to that title.
Yeah.
And so what I discovered, I'll go back to that, is I started studying relationships. What are the core elements of relationships? What do we like if I'm in a healthy marriage, what am I doing? There's compromise, sharing feelings, being vulnerable, communication, conflict resolution, intimacy beyond, other than sex. Just those 6, 7 that I just mentioned. Just think about the man rules in relation to that. Don't talk. Don't cry. Don't ask for help. Don't be vulnerable. Don't compromise. Everything's a fight. Real men have power. Sex is, defines masculinity.
Yeah.
So you have this dissonance, right? These competing lists, these competing kind of elements. And that's what's in men. So when men are like, when you're like, well, they have to communicate in order to get better, in order to grow. And yet that's what they've been taught. They've not only been not taught to do that, they've been taught not to do that.
Right. Yeah. To proactively not do that.
Proactively not do it.
Yes.
Right? They've literally, we've not only been told don't be emotional, we've been trained and shamed not to be emotional.
Right.
So that's like the rub. And for me personally, that's kind of my mission, is to try to unpack and expose some of that so that we can be more thoughtful in how we make these decisions consciously. Yeah. And then men can really, they really have a chance at being like who they really want to be. There's a lot of guys walking around today, like they're going to die not ever having been known.
Wow.
And that's heartbreaking.
That's tragic.
It is tragic. And that's the end result of the man rules.
Dang. Well,
on that happy note.
On that note, oh my God. Well, that is the end result of the man rules, but for the work that you do, Dan. So thank you for doing the work that you do.
And many, many, many others are doing it too. I mean, there is a energy, right? There is something. And personally, thank you for saying that. But I also say, to me, it's very spiritual. I believe this is where God is leading us as human beings to shed the weight of this gender conditioning that, frankly, I've yet to meet somebody who was truly honest. That was just like, I love the box that I'm stuck in as a man or a woman.
Right. Yeah. Very true. Wow. Well, thank you so much for being on Made for More. You and all of us are clearly made for more, and you are working towards that end. So we all thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been an enjoyable conversation.
I've got just a little bit more to say. Dan mentioned something that I think whether you're a man or a woman or anything else, we could all benefit from asking ourselves this question. And it's, is who I am and how I live truly reflective of the man or woman or person I want to be? Don't forget, you were made for more. Whiny little... Ugh!